with their government out of fear that they want the whole country to go communist. Well, what happened? We lost the war, we left, they didn't go communist, they're trading partners that are ours, they've been westernized, we invest over there, they invest over here. Just think of what was achieved in peace that couldn't be achieved with war. War is always a drain, and there's explicit ways to go to war. We should never accept the principle of preemptive war. Preemptive war means we start them. We don't have a right to start wars. We have an obligation to make our country safe and secure and have a national defense, but you don't do that by using war as the weapon. We have been taught for too long in our colleges, and the status quo or the conventional wisdom is that war can get you out of a depression or a bad recession. That is exactly right. It isn't right, it's wrong. Even if it did do that, it never justifies that type of killing, but it doesn't work. Wars are always an economic cost to a society. Not only do I look to the Constitution for the decision-making when you go to war, but also to the Christian just war principles. If we followed those, believe me, there'd be a lot less fighting and killing in the world. We would be much richer. In the last 10 years, we have accumulated $4 trillion worth of debt due to the wars that we're fighting. Think how far that money could have gone in society here. How much better off we would be. We wouldn't be so much in debt. Today we are a poorer nation. We have the greatest debt in the history of the world, and both foreign and domestic. And it is the foreign policy that brings people down so often. It isn't the wars that finally eliminate a whole empire. The Soviets went down not because we had to have that war, but because they finally went bankrupt and they had to go home. And this is today our greatest threat. The one thing I can assure you of, with my experience in the service and my experience in Washington, in knowing a little bit about our military power, we do not have to worry about anybody touching us militarily. We have the strongest military defense in the world. But I wish I could assure you with that much confidence about we have nothing to worry about. Because when we take an oath in the office, we take an oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, I'm more worried right now about the domestic problems we have. Think of how our civil liberties have been undermined in these past 10 years. And it has years so you can understand it, but it doesn't justify it. And we have accepted this notion in this last decade that it's okay to sacrifice some of our liberties to be safe. That is correct. It is never necessary to sacrifice liberty for the safety. And the founder said, if you do, you're not going to be safe, and you will lose everything. You will not, and you'll lose your liberties as well. And that is what happened. So immediately after 9/11. Within a week or two, we passed this thing called the Patriot Act. Now, I know personally some members of Congress have voted for the Patriot Act because they said it sounded good. I argued with one member on the day he was voting for it, and I said, why are you voting for this? You haven't even had time to read it. It just came up an hour ago. He said, oh, I know. I said, you know, there's some bad stuff in this bill. He says, I know. And I said, why are you going to vote for it? He says, well, I just can't go home and explain to my constituents under these conditions why I voted against the Patriot Act. I said, well, that's your job. Go home and explain it to them. If the Patriot Act had been called Repeal the Fourth Amendment Act, maybe a lot less people would have voted for it. So next year we'll also put on the list the repeal of the Patriot Act and get your... So we'll call that bill Restore the Fourth Amendment Act, and maybe more people will vote are being systematically undermined. With the Patriot Act, we've essentially lost our privacy, and it has been eroding for a long time, but it is essentially gone. It also gives the authority to this agency of government, which I hope is not a friend of yours because it's not a friend of mine, and that's TSA at the airport. You know, actually, the purpose of the members of Congress and the President isn't to make us safe. The Second Amendment is supposed to make us safe. But the purpose, the oath of office is that we don't take an oath to, an allegiance to our political parties, or that we provide safety above all efforts and ignore liberty. The oath of office is obey the law and obey the Constitution. That's what the oath of office says. There's been a bit of an uproar just in the last couple of weeks, and justified to a large degree, about the President lecturing the Supreme Court on what they should do with Obamacare. And of course, I think the easiest answer there is repeal the whole thing and start as bad as it was, the President interfering and trying to lecture the Supreme Court, I wasn't as annoyed about that as some other things. What about the President declaring unilaterally by executive order that he can be the prosecutor, that he can be the judge and the jury and the executioner? And that the law of the land says that the President can make the decision to assassinate an American citizen. If we aren't annoyed enough on what we see at the airports when we look at those pictures and all those x-rays, if we're not annoyed enough about the military being able to arrest us, or the American to decide who can be assassinated, I'll tell you what, we're not deserving of very much, but I'll give you some good news. The people in this country aren't going to put up with it, and they're changing their minds, and they want it to change. About economic policy, monetary policy, or civil liberties, or foreign policy. I think about the individual liberties and the importance of individuals. And I think that's what made America great. It was the individual. The Declaration of Independence is very clear about where our lives and our liberties come from. They come from our Creator, and they're not from our government. Of course, the founders understood what the consequence would that be, and that is, if you have a right to your life and a right to your liberty and an obligation to take care of yourself, you ought to have the right to keep the fruits of your labor. Just remember, it wasn't the founders that gave us the income tax. That came in the Progressive era in 1913 along with the Federal Reserve. So we'll add that to the list too. Repeal the 16th Amendment. There's always an excuse, for all the laws. This January 1st, we had 40,000 new laws placed on the books. And once again, I would really enjoy being the first president that eliminated 40,000 laws.